Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Richard Seidlitz and I'm the owner of redpants.lol. In this video, I'll be talking about all the things you need to do to maintain a 2005 to 2018 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. This is my second video in this series, which covers buying, maintaining, and ownership in general for these cars. My last video was about finding and buying a V8 Vantage, and it was very long, well over 20 minutes. My first attempt at making this video included a lot of very relevant but ultimately tangential information, and it ended up being well over 45 minutes long. Let's just say I couldn't quite make it through the whole thing. I've cut out a lot of the extra stuff and we'll probably cover it in another video, but even so, this video is still going to be pretty long as it is. So grab a drink or three and get comfy. First things first, let's cover the basics. I'll be breaking the maintenance items in this video into three categories. First, the regularly scheduled items as outlined by Aston Martin's own service guidelines. Second, the common maintenance items that aren't on a set schedule but have a general time frame for when they'll need to be replaced. And third, maintenance items that are highly variable and depend entirely on how they're used. I will not be covering repairs, recalls, or TSBs in this video, although I might mention a couple, nor will I be detailing the various things to check and inspect during maintenance. This is just about the maintenance items themselves. Now, a very common question I get is what maintenance should be done and when, especially from people that just bought their first Aston Martin. My advice is to check through the car's maintenance history and see when each item was last done. If something hasn't been done within its service interval, do that thing, and then set that as the starting point for its service interval going forward. Now, in a perfect world, all service items would be done as scheduled for a car, but that's very often not the case. And this might seem a little confusing at first, but when taking each item individually, like we're about to do, it'll start to make a lot more sense, so don't worry about it too much. The last thing before we begin is I want to clarify that I do sell both OEM and aftermarket items on Redpants, and I'll be mentioning both throughout this video to help give you an idea of what's available. There are other options for some of these things out there, but if you'd like to show some support, please consider shopping at Redpants, as those sales are what makes it possible for me to keep making these videos that not only keep you informed, but also help save you hundreds or even thousands of dollars per year owning your Aston Martin. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go over scheduled maintenance items. Aston Martin's scheduled maintenance items are based on an interval of 1 year or 10,000 miles, whichever one comes first. That means everyone will fall into one of two categories. If you drive your Aston Martin less than 10,000 miles per year, you should do your maintenance at the same time each year, regardless of how many or how few miles you've driven during that time. The vast majority of Aston Martin owners fall into that category. If you're one of the few that drive your Aston more than 10,000 miles per year, though, you'll do your maintenance whenever you've driven those 10,000 miles since your previous service. Now, I have tons of information about all the stuff I'm about to talk about on www.redpants.lol, including videos and DIY guides for most of this. So make sure you check the links in the description below for all the things I'm about to cover. The first year of service is an easy one. It's just an oil change. Now, the V8 Vantage has two different engines, a 4.3 liter and a 4.7 liter, and they are indeed different. I offer two oil change kits on Redpants for the V8 Vantage, one for each engine. Both kits include an oil filter, oil reservoir drain washer, and sump plug, which is basically a drain plug with a built-in rubber gasket. The 4.3 liter has a pair of bypass filters for the dry sump oil system, and these need to be cleaned as part of the oil change. The factory Torx bolts for the bypass covers are notorious for stripping, so I include new hex bolts with the kit to replace them, as well as a bolt that's used to remove the bypass filters themselves from the car. Now, the two bypass filters each have an O-ring, so two new O-rings are included with the 4.3 liter kit as well. The bypass filters were eliminated on the 4.7 liter engine, and a sump plug was put in place of each. So the 4.7 liter kit includes an extra pair of sump plugs, but not the bypass filter bolts or O-rings of the 4.3 liter kit. Of course, you'll need to replace your engine oil in your car when doing your oil change. The factory fill was from Castrol. It was Castrol Edge Sports. Sometimes I think they called it TWS, which literally just stands for 10W60. And that oil has been reformulated and rebranded a few times, and now it's called, I think, Edge Professional Supercar something or other, and there's like 3 different versions of it, last time I checked at least. Lots of people ask what kind of engine oil they should use in their Aston. Now, I sell Motul products, and that's what I use in my own cars, but honestly, Any high quality full synthetic oil from a reputable brand that meets factory requirements will do the job. The oil should be 10W60, but if you're in a cold climate, then 5W50 can be a safe alternative. Now, don't let people get you too hung up on what should be the oil to use. This is something that's always contested, always will be. Just use the right kind of oil and stick to the one that you like. Now, an oil change should be done every single year, and all the components included in my Red Pants oil change kits should be used. Reusing any of these individual parts that are already on your car can result in oil leaks, and the cost and hassle of redoing an oil change simply because these parts were reused is not worth the risk. So, oil change every year or 10,000 miles, whichever comes first. The second year service includes engine intake filters, cabin filters, brake fluid, key fob batteries, and windshield wiper blades. The V8 Vantage has a pair of engine intake filters, one located under each of the headlights. The OEM filters have a paper filtration media, which is common for an OEM filter and offers great protection for your engine. If you want an aftermarket option, I have my own Red Pants intake filters, which are made of cloth. Cloth filters offer less protection but are more breathable, and it's very commonly used for aftermarket and performance air filters. There are two types of cloth filters available. You have a dry filter and an oiled filter. Cloth filters are washable and reusable, which is not possible with paper filters. Paper filters need to be replaced after their service interval has expired. Now, I have a lot more information on Red Pants about the pros and cons of paper, dry cloth, and oiled cloth filters, so check out the link in the description below for more information to help you decide what's the best choice for you. Cabin filters, also called pollen filters, clean the air passing through your car's heating, venting, and air conditioning system, or HVAC. I sell aftermarket ones like this on Red Pants that are far less expensive, but just as good, if not better, than the OEM ones, which cost about 5 times as much. Now, even though there are two filters, they actually sit side by side. They're located directly behind the glove box and can be replaced with some basic hand tools. Even though these have a 2-year service life, if you live in a harsh climate or have allergies or other respiratory sensitivities, it might be worth replacing the cabin filters every year rather than every other year. Brake fluid is a critical part of your braking system, so do not ignore this service item. The factory brake fluid was Castrol Response Super DOT4, and like their engine oil, it has been reformulated and rebranded, so don't expect to see this exact product name anymore. Being a Motul fan, again, I use their products in my own fluids. We have a few different ones here. We have DOT 5.1, RBF 600, and RBF 660. If you do not track your car, the DOT 5.1 is a perfectly adequate brake fluid. It's a fantastic brake fluid for normal and spirited driving. But if you do track your car, I'd highly suggest moving up to the RBF 600 like this one. And if you are a track junkie that goes really hardcore, or you actually race, you'll want something more aggressive like the RBF 660. Now, the only drawback to using a more expensive brake fluid than you actually need is the cost. There's nothing wrong with using an RBF 660 in a car that only ever sees the grocery store, except that you're going to be paying 3 times as much for it than you would for a DOT 5.1, which is perfect for the car the way you drive it. If you have a manual transmission, you should also flush the clutch line at the same time as when you flush the brake lines. This is done the exact same way as the brake lines, and the clutch line for the manual transmission uses the same brake fluid from the brake fluid reservoir, so this is the perfect time to flush it. This little task is one that seems to be very, very commonly overlooked, and many people don't seem to realize just how important it can be. I've had a few people tell me it felt like their cars had brand new clutches after I flushed the long neglected clutch lines. The Sport Shift transmission uses hydraulic fluid in the clutch line, so do not mess with it. Take it to a dealership or an indie shop that has an AMDS to get the Sport Shift clutch line flushed. The key fob uses standard watch batteries, like this one, and there's nothing special about these batteries at all. Aston Martin's service guidelines say that the batteries in the key fob should be changed as part of the 2-year service, but honestly, they tend to last much, much longer than just 2 years. The last of the 2-year maintenance items is replacing the windshield wiper blades. Just like the cabin filters, I don't even sell the OEM blades. The OEM wiper blades are very expensive from Aston Martin, and aftermarket options are readily available. I personally use Bosch Icon wiper blades like these ones, and I have affiliate links to those on Red Pants if you'd like to show some support. Engine intake filters, cabin filters, brake fluid, key fob batteries, and windshield wiper blades should be changed every 2 years or 20,000 miles, whichever comes first. And don't forget that annual oil change when doing your 2-year service. I do sell 2-year service packages on Red Pants to make this as simple as possible. They include an oil change kit, engine intake filters, cabin filters, and a throttle body gasket, which I'll mention later on. I used to include brake fluid as well, but stopped due to shipping restrictions. Motul brake fluid is still available on Red Pants, but I can only ship it to certain markets. I also have affiliate links on Red Pants to the key fob batteries and wiper blades, so please consider using those if you'd like to support Red Pants. Even though you'll be buying from a different vendor, the pennies for the referral that I get do add up. There isn't anything that needs to be done on a 3-year basis unless you're spacing out your engine intake filters or something, so do your annual oil change and check to make sure the car is in good condition. The 4th year, though, requires your gear oil be replaced. The drain and fill plugs for the gearbox each have a copper washer, and the transmission filter has an O-ring. The transmission filter needs to be cleaned and then can be reused, but the O-ring for it needs to be replaced. Likewise, the drain and fill plugs are reused, but their copper washers need to be replaced. So I offer a gear oil change package on Red Pants that includes both those O-rings and washers to make life easy. There are a lot of options for gear oil, and this is something you'll want to pay more attention to than just the price. The V8 Vantage has a transaxle, which is a transmission that also incorporates a differential. Gear oils designed specifically for use in limited slip differentials contain additives, but those additives can damage transmissions. So even though the transmission and limited slip differential of a V8 Vantage use the same gear oil, do not use gear oil for limited slip differentials, the ones that have limited slip differential additives. The 2 main products that I use myself and sell on Red Pants are the factory Castrol BOT270A and Motul Gear 300. Castrol BOT270A was not the original gear oil used in the V8 Vantage. That was a Shell transaxle oil. But Aston Martin got a lot of complaints about stiff shifting between first and second gear when the transmission was cold. So they switched over to this gear oil made by Castrol to help alleviate that cold shifting issue, as well as changing a leverage point on the shifter arm. Now this Castrol gear oil does provide smoother shifting in most conditions, but something to know about it is that it is a lighter gear oil and doesn't hold up as well under tough conditions. Simply put, it sacrifices protection for your gearbox for the sake of smoother shifting when cold. This isn't a problem for many Aston Martin owners, so if you're not doing track days or racing, or if you don't drive your car that hard, you'll be perfectly fine with the BOT270A. But if you do hit the track, and especially if you race, you'll want something that provides more protection, like Motul Gear 300. Now, as an aside, this Motul Gear 300 does have some of the best specs that I've seen for viscosity when hot and cold, so it does provide excellent gearbox protection even on track, and it's nearly as smooth as the Castrol BOT270A when it's cold. Gear oil, also known as transmission fluid, should be replaced every 4 years or 40,000 miles, whichever one comes first. The 5th year requires the coolant be replaced. Now this one is a bit tricky as the coolant in a V8 Vantage can only be gravity drained about a gallon or so at a time. That means if you don't have a coolant exchanger that sucks out the old coolant and pushes in the new coolant, you'll have to do things the hard way. Gravity drain what you can, add new coolant to replace what was just drained, cycle the engine, and then do it again, and again, and again a few more times. And honestly, this is one of those jobs I tell people to take to a shop that has a coolant exchanger simply because it is such a pain and so messy for people doing it at home. Be very careful if you're not using the factory Havoline HLC coolant, as mixing incompatible coolants can destroy a cooling system and an engine along with it. Now, I've seen coolant turn to sludge firsthand, and it is not pretty. The factory coolant is organic, so do not use any other coolant type. The closest match to factory that I've seen is Motul InnoGel Ultima Optimal Ultra. I always mess that up. And the next closest is Jaguar's OEM coolant, but there are others out there if you want to do some research. I also suggest the thermostat be replaced at the same time as the coolant flush, and that's something I'll get into later in this video. The coolant should be flushed every 5 years or 50,000 miles, whichever comes first. Just like year 3, there's nothing on a 6-year schedule that needs to be done, so just do your oil change and whatever other maintenance items land on this based on your car and its maintenance item intervals. The 7th year requires your spark plugs be replaced. The factory spark plugs are iridium and made by NGK. They're a carryover item from Jaguar, so these are the ones that I sell on Red Pants, as the Jaguar badge tax is far less than that of Aston Martin. This is a super easy job except for one spark plug at the back of the engine, but I have a DIY video showing the trick to getting that one, so it's actually a pretty easy job overall. I also recommend that the coil packs be replaced at the same time, and I'll talk about that later on in this video. Spark plugs should be changed every 7 years or 70,000 miles, whichever comes first. After that 7th year service, there isn't another unique maintenance item for a long time. You'll just need to keep repeating all those services we've just covered. That is until the 15th year. The front end accessory drive belt, or FEAD, feed belt, is the serpentine belt on the front of the engine that transmits energy from the engine's crank pulley to the pulleys of the alternator, power steering, and air conditioning to power those systems. This part, and one of the pulleys called an idler assembly here, were prone to squealing and chirping when cold on earlier engines. The belts and pulleys were each updated to fix the issue, but not at the same time. So you'll need to check which belt and which idler assembly you have on your car. You may need one or the other, or both. But regardless of what's actually on your car, you'll need both of them, the updated feed belt and the updated pulley, to ensure the belt stays silent. One or the other won't cut it. And no spraying, anti-squeal, or lubricants does not fix the actual problem. It only hides it and can actually cause the belt to get destroyed that much worse. Aside from replacing an outdated belt with the updated part, the feed belt needs to be replaced every 15 years or 150,000 miles, whichever comes first. However, it should be checked during annual services and replaced if it shows any fraying or other damage, regardless of its age or miles. Now that we've covered the scheduled maintenance items, let's move on to our next category. Maintenance items that are not on the routine schedule, but generally need to be replaced after a set amount of time or miles. Even though these aren't on the maintenance schedule, we can still use that years or miles rule to figure out when they'll need to be replaced or expect them to need to be replaced. The main thing I'd suggest servicing in 2 or 3 year intervals is the throttle body. And by service, I mean clean, so don't think it's anything too invasive. It's a good idea to clean your throttle body every couple of years as preventative maintenance. This is a simple job, and it removes any buildup or carbon or whatever that may prevent your throttle body from working properly. As with any gasket or O-ring, the throttle body gasket, which is what's used on the V8 Vantage, the V12, by the way, uses a throttle body O-ring, the throttle body gasket should be replaced once it's been removed from the car. Since I generally suggest cleaning the throttle body every other year, I include a throttle body gasket in my 2-year service packages on Red Pants. There are a few things to pay attention to that tend to need servicing or replacement every 5 to 7 years, so let's go over those. Car batteries are generally designed to last about 5 years, but this can be highly variable based on usage, climate, and battery type. I have a great video about Aston Martin batteries on YouTube already, so I'm not going to go in depth about them again. Check out that video for a bunch of information and for an explanation about why it's important to pay attention to the age of an Aston Martin's battery. The super short version is that as a battery ages, it loses its ability to hold charge. And a battery that can't hold enough charge because of its age can cause a variety of gremlins in an Aston Martin. So expect to replace your Aston Martin's battery every 5 to 7 years. The thermostat in a V8 Vantage has a rubber gasket that's molded onto it. Over time, this gasket can wear out and then tear, and once that happens, the thermostat can no longer function properly because it can no longer seal properly. This is a very easy thing to diagnose because your coolant temperature gauge will have a hard time getting to that halfway point, which is where it should be during normal operating conditions. The thing is, once you notice this, it's already too late. The gasket has torn. This may not seem like a big deal, but it can be. I've worked on a few cars that had pieces of the gasket actually missing, which meant that a piece of this gasket broke off and got circulated into the cooling system. It's possible for loose pieces of the gasket to get stuck somewhere and clog coolant passageways, so this is something you'll want to prevent rather than repair. I've noticed these start to fail somewhere between 5 and 10 years, so I recommend the thermostat be replaced proactively as preventive maintenance at the same time as the coolant flush, which is every 5 years or 50,000 miles. This is another carryover part from Jaguar, and I sell Jaguar ones on Red Pants as they cost much less for the same part than they would be from Aston Martin. I also highly recommend replacing the thermostat seal when you replace the thermostat. This will help ensure that you don't have a leak at the thermostat housing, and I do sell these as a package together on Red Pants. One thing I've had to replace on my own car and a couple of others is the PCV valve. That is the positive crankcase ventilation valve. The job of the PCV valve is to release pressure from the engine's crankcase. Oil vapors from the crankcase pass through the PCV valve, which can build up over time and prevent the PCV valve from working properly. Thus, the need for a replacement. A telltale sign that a PCV valve has already gone bad is when it starts to buzz. If you hear a buzz from your engine bay while the car is idling, press down on top of the PCV valve firmly, but you don't have to press it into anything. You're just putting pressure on it. If the noise stops, you know the PCV valve is making that noise and it needs to be replaced. I knew these could go bad over time, but I didn't think it was that big of a deal or terribly common until a buddy of mine at Aston Martin told me that he thinks these should be replaced every 5 years or so as preventative maintenance. I've got these at Red Pants and a DIY guide showing how to do this, so it's a pretty easy job, so don't worry about it. The struts that hold open the hood, doors, and trunk do wear out over time and at some point will no longer be able to stay propped open on their own. And that seems to happen after around 5 to 7 years. Each of these tends to fail a little bit differently, at least from what I've seen. It's usually pretty easy to know when the hood struts need to be replaced because one day you'll open up the hood, it'll say no thank you, and will politely close itself. The doors, meanwhile, tend to weaken slowly. You'll notice that they gradually work less and less like a disgruntled employee that cares less each day until finally quits working altogether. And then you have the trunk struts. These things are assholes. They often won't give any real indication that they're starting to fail and then will announce their abrupt retirement by dropping the trunk lid on your head while you're rummaging about in the trunk. And yes, it really hurts. The hood and trunk struts are super easy to replace, but the door struts do take a bit of extra work. There's also a tiny strut for the fuel filler lid for the Roadster, but not one for the coupe. And as you can see, these wear out as well. I sell all of these struts on Red Pants and have DIY guides showing how to do the door struts and fuel filler lid struts, so these 5 to 7 year replacement items can be pretty easy and inexpensive to take care of yourself. The last thing I'll talk about for the 5 to 7 year maintenance period is tires. Yes, tire service life is usually based on wear. Once the tires have worn down to a certain point, they get replaced and that's that. However, age is a critical aspect of a tire's service life, so this does apply very specifically to Aston Martins, which may not be driven enough to wear them down within that time period. Regardless of how few miles you've driven, tires should be replaced after 5 years as the rubber can and will dry up and split apart as the tires age. This is a critical safety component, so I never recommend people skimp on tires. I'm not going to go too in-depth into tires in this video as there'd be way too much to cover, but the main thing I'll say is that this is one of those areas where I will tell people, and I do tell people very often, to ditch the OEM items right away. The OEM Bridgestone Potenza RE050 tires are rubbish. I'm a huge fan of the Michelin Pilot Sport 4S. They're a phenomenal tire on both street and track, and they beat out the OEM Bridgestones in every way, and I mean from performance to comfort. While I often suggest people hold off on maintenance upgrades, that is, a maintenance item that can be upgraded when they need to be replaced during normal service, I'd actually say that swapping out the OEM Bridgestones for a set of Michelin Pilot Sport 4Ss is such a drastic improvement for the car as a whole that I'd recommend doing it even if the Bridgestones still have plenty of life left. In addition to tire types, you can also play around with sizing a little bit. For example, a set of 19-inch tires in V8 Vantage S sizing fit beautifully on the wheels of a standard V8 Vantage. Again, this is a very big topic and I've got plenty of information about tires on Red Pants, so check out my website for more. Next, let's go over a couple of things that only need to be addressed every 7 to 10 years. One of the things that's going to go bad after 7 or 10 years are the batteries in the tire pressure monitoring sensors. There's one of these in each wheel, and each one corresponds to a different light on the module. Now this module, so in my car it was located underneath the dashboard of my 2007 V8 Vantage, and each one of these lights has a different color that's marked on it. And that color corresponds to a different sensor, so you know which sensor caused the warning. The thing is, there's one warning for all issues. So if the battery goes bad inside of a sensor, you have a low tire pressure sensor warning. You have a low tire warning. If the tire goes flat, you have a low tire warning. If the module gets unplugged, low tire warning. It's the same thing for all of them. It's kind of like the emissions warning, which I'll talk about later. When these come on, it's either because of a dead battery, a flat tire, or this got disconnected. Luckily, for me at least, and for many of you, if you have an earlier car, so I think it was about halfway or so through 2007, you could actually Prior to sometime in 2007, you could actually unplug this module and disable the entire system. But because Aston Martin caught wind of that and they realized what was going on, they added a fourth wire to this plug harness so that if this got disconnected, it would automatically trigger that warning light. So you're going to get a flat tire warning or a low tire warning for a dead battery and a sensor, an actual flat tire, or an unplugged module. Now, if it is a flat tire, obviously fix your flat tire, replace it, plug it, whatever you have to do. But if it is a dead battery, you can either replace the sensor with a new one. If you want to be super brave, I've heard of people digging into these and like gutting them and replacing the battery, which is not meant to be serviceable, so it's not actually that easy as far as I'm aware. Or you can disable this system. I sell a TPMS defeat that plugs in here, and it's basically a link in the middle where the main harness is and this harness, it plugs in between, and it disables the TPMS system. Of course, the big caveat there is you no longer have a TPMS system at all. So if you get a flat tire, you're not going to get warned about it. You're just going to have a flat tire and you got to deal with it like you would before 5 years ago. So welcome back to the 90s. Is it? The 90s were longer ago than 5 years. But that is something to know, especially on the earlier ones. These OEM smart tire sensors can be stupid expensive. I mean, like several $100s for a set of 4 of these things, so be ready. In my V8 Vantage Buyer's Guide video, I talked about the factory clear vinyl and how it needed to be replaced once in a while. 2 primary things contribute to vinyl wrap needing to be replaced: wear and tear and age. The more abuse vinyl wrap takes, the more beat up it will get. You'll start to see it looking a bit chewed up as it gets pelted by rocks and sticks and pedestrians. But that's not a bad thing because that's what the vinyl is for, and you'd rather have it get beat up than your paint. Even if your clear vinyl manages to avoid too many battle scars, it can still turn yellow over time, so you'll still want to replace it after a while anyway. There are a few options when it comes time to replace the factory clear vinyl. You can replace it with new factory pieces, or you can do a custom clear wrap that covers more or all of the car, or you can even do a full wrap that changes the color of your car. Personally, I recommend a full wrap, whether you're using clear vinyl to keep the factory paint color showing, or doing a color changing wrap to switch things up a bit. None of these are uncommon in the car world, in the automotive world, so don't be afraid to explore your options. Regardless of which direction you go though, I would personally recommend wrapping as much of the car as possible and make sure it's done as best as possible. So long as you're using a high quality vinyl product and it's installed properly, a clear vinyl wrap or just a vinyl wrap in general can last 7 to 10 years. And remember, this is an investment in your car. It's going to protect your paint, at least from the most major of accidents, which are going to be a bigger issue anyway. But 7 to 10 years of an investment is not bad. Earlier I talked about spark plugs, which are a scheduled maintenance item. To replace those, you need to remove the coil packs, as a coil pack sits on top of each spark plug like this. I've noticed that the coil packs can start to fail between 7 and 10 years, so I recommend they be replaced as preventive maintenance at the same time as your spark plugs, which is every 7 years or 70,000 miles. The coil packs have to be removed to get to the spark plugs anyway, so there's no extra work whatsoever when it comes to replacing them at the same time. And the last thing I'll mention for the 7 to 10 year time frame is the O2 sensors. While the downstream O2 sensors tend to last a very, very long time, the upstream sensors may need to be replaced every several years. You shouldn't need to worry about doing these proactively as preventive maintenance. Rather, you can just wait until the emission system warning on your gauge cluster display comes up. Quick side note though, that same emissions warning is used for several things, so it does not automatically mean that you have an O2 sensor that needs to be replaced. When you see the emissions system warning, you need to pull the codes to see what is actually causing that warning. Now, I do recommend O2 sensors be replaced in pairs. So if you have a problem with one of your upstream O2 sensors, I suggest replacing both upstream O2 sensors at the same time. And now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, we've made it to the last section of our video. Maintenance items that are based almost entirely on usage. These are things that need to be replaced or serviced based on how they're used or abused, and age itself generally isn't a factor. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are watching this video with a keen eye on the clutch because this is the big scary, so let's start here. Now, believe it or not, Aston Martin themselves expected the clutch in the V8 Vantage to need to be replaced every 25, 70,000 miles. And yes, you heard me correctly. I'll be doing a video dedicated to this topic, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on so you know when that video goes live. As far as maintenance is concerned, there are a few options when replacing the clutch in a V8 Vantage. You can use the same single plate clutch as was originally fitted to the car, like this one. The 4.7 liter cars did get a slightly lighter flywheel than was used with the 4.3 liter engine. It was only about a pound of weight reduction, so half a kilo, so it's only going to be a tiny difference, but it is an option. What I use myself and what I recommend to my customers is a twin plate clutch and lightweight flywheel setup, which is what I'm just going to call clutch package from now on, because I've gone through 3 of these drinks trying to get through this section of the video and I keep getting tongue-tied. If you have a manual transmission, there is a clutch package from AMR, which is Aston Martin's in-house performance brand. However, as of this video and since that clutch package was first released, they have said that it is only available for the manual and not for the sport shift transmission. But fear not, because regardless of which transmission you have, there are aftermarket options available. The one that I use myself is from Velocity AP. It uses an OEM clutch from a V12 Aston Martin with a custom flywheel. The result is a much quicker throttle response and a clutch with a much longer service life potential. This is also a fantastic option for those of you with sport shift cars, as I've gotten a lot of positive feedback and reviews from customers about how much that clutch package improved the sport shift transmission, especially by smoothing out shifts. A twin plate clutch and lightweight flywheel package is going to cost more than the OEM or just flat out original single plate clutch setup, but the longer service life potential should balance out the higher cost of the parts by saving on labor, as it won't have to be replaced as often. Not to mention the performance benefits, which those alone I think are worth the higher prices for the parts. One of the benefits of the sport shift transmission is that a clutch reading can be performed using an AMDS. If you take your sport shift car to a dealership or to one of the handful of independent shops that have an AMDS, they can plug into the car and take a clutch reading to see approximately how much life is left in the clutch. For those of us with a manual transmission, we generally have to find out that our clutch needs to be replaced the hard way when it starts slipping. A crude test that I do not recommend doing often is to drive the car in a high gear at low speeds, so 25 miles per hour in 6th gear or something like that, and then you step on the gas. If the engine revs up, it means that the clutch is slipping and is at or near the end of its life. If the engine bogs down, it means that the clutch is grabbing and is still good. Again, this is something that I do not recommend unless you really want to know how the clutch is going to respond. Now, the clutch is the biggest maintenance item for a V8 Vantage, and you can expect to shell out several $1,000s for parts and labor every 25 to 75,000 miles, depending on how it's used, how it's abused, and what kind of clutch you have. Aside from your brake fluid, the rest of your car's braking components require maintenance based on how they're used. So let's start off with brake pads. This is a topic that I've talked about ad nauseum, and if I were to regurgitate all that information, this video would be 3 times as long as it already is, and frankly, I don't have the liver for that. So I'm going to summarize this as quickly as possible. A key factor in why the OEM brake pads were chosen for the V8 Vantage is that they're able to stop the car from extremely high speeds repeatedly. However, many Aston Martin owners don't drive their cars in a way that utilizes the available performance of the OEM brake pads. So instead of appreciating the OEM pads for those performance benefits, they actually dislike the pads for all the drawbacks that come with them. The OEM pads, which are the Pagid 422, not Brembo, create a lot of dust and can squeal pretty badly at low speeds. If you don't need the higher performance potential of the OEM pads, you can swap out your pads for a different type. There are 2 different braking systems that are used on the V8 Vantage. One with 4-piston front calipers and one with 6-piston front calipers. The system with 4-piston front calipers was the original type as used back in 2005 and for several years after. The V8 Vantage S introduced the 6-piston setup, and then that same 6-piston setup was used on all V8 Vantages starting about a quarter of the way into the 2012 model year. The 4-piston and 6-piston calipers use different brake pads, and they are not interchangeable. I already have a full video covering brake pad options for the 4-piston setup, so check out that video. I'll have a link in the description below, and you should check it out. I go over the R4S, the HPS 5.0, and a couple other ones. It's definitely worth watching, and it's going to help you understand the range of availability and why each one matters. Now, if you have a 6-piston setup, things are a little bit easier for you. The brake pads used in the 6-piston calipers are so big that you can use a gentler pad like the Porterfield R4S and get all the benefits they offer without the drawbacks that you would lose from like track performance, say, with the 4-piston calipers. I was a bit skeptical about this until a buddy of mine named Dan took me out for some laps at Lime Rock. And sure enough, the 6-piston RS, I can't even talk right now. The 6-piston, there's a Sandhill crane outside that is trying to mate really hard right now, so it's Florida life. We went out at Lime Rock, and he has the R4S 6-piston brake pads in his car, in his V8 Vantage S, and he was putting down some blazing quick lap times, and the R4S brake pads were holding up beautifully. Now, these don't have the brake dust or squeal that the factory pads have, and without the drawbacks that you would have on a 4-piston setup where you're losing track performance, if you have the 6-piston setup, honestly, I think this is a no-brainer. That's just my opinion, but this is my go-to pad for anybody with a 6-piston setup, whether or not you do track days. So, that is without actual racing conditions. At that point, again, that's a whole other thing. The V8 Vantage has brake pad wear sensors connected to one of the brake pads on each caliper. When the pad's friction material gets too thin, the brake rotor comes into contact with the brake sensor, and it shears off the surface of the sensor, that nub right there. That contact triggers a warning light on the instrument cluster saying that the brake pads are low. Once this happens, the sensor or sensors that trigger the warning need to be replaced. If a sensor did not come into contact with the rotor, it can be reused. Likewise, if you replace the brake pads before they get so thin that this sensor comes into contact with the rotor, you don't have to change these sensors, you just change your brake pads. The handbrake or parking brake or e-brake of the V8 Vantage uses a ratcheting lever to engage and release an extra caliper on each of the rear brake rotors. It's a mouthful. Even though these are used for holding the car in place when parked, the pads are actually coming into contact with the rotors at all times. They skim them, so they do wear down and need to be replaced occasionally. A couple things to know about these pads is that they can cause a chirping sound from their design, the OEM pads at least. And that chirp will seem like it's coming from the front of the car, but it's actually coming from the handbrakes at the rear. So if you hear a chirping sound at super low speeds, like when you're parking in a car park or parking lot, you hear that chirp, 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 it's actually going to be the handbrake pads. You can remedy this by chamfering the handbrake pads, the factory ones, or by getting a set of Porterfield R4S handbrake pads that I offer on Red Pants, which are already chamfered, which is that beveling that you see, and it prevents that chirping sound. It's also important to know that these pads usually wear unevenly. The handbrake caliper is a single piston design, so one pad is getting pushed against the rotor harder than the other. So when you inspect the handbrake pads on your car, it's very important to check both pads in each caliper, not just the ones that are visible from the outside of the car. There are 3 types of brake rotors used on the V8 Vantage. The early cars with the 4-piston front brake calipers use a single-piece ventilated and slotted rotor. The V8 Vantage S, which introduced the 6-piston calipers, came with a larger rotor, which was also a 2-piece design. When those 6-piston calipers were implemented across the V8 Vantage range early on in the 2012 model year, the non-S cars got a 1.5-piece rotor design. It's something of a hybrid between a traditional single-piece rotor and the far more expensive 2-piece rotors. As you can see on my 2007 V8 Vantage, I'm using a set of Wilwood 2-piece rotors, which are sized for cars with the 4-piston front calipers. If you have 6-piston front calipers, the 1.5-piece and 2-piece brake rotors are interchangeable. So you can upgrade a base V8 Vantage to the rotors of a V8 Vantage S, or you can save a bunch of money on maintenance for your V8 Vantage S by downgrading the rotors to the 1.5-piece version. All of these options are slotted, which is great for performance without risking the structural integrity of the rotors, and I do offer all of them on Red Pants. While not exactly maintenance items per se, garage rot does fall under the broad category of usage-based maintenance. As I mentioned in my V8 Vantage Buyer's Guide video, garage rot is what I call all the things that can go bad on a car that sits undriven for too long. The best way to prevent garage rot is quite simple. Just drive the car once every few weeks. But if you know you're going to be storing the car for a long period of time, like my friends up in the great cold Canada, you can do a few things to help prevent or at least minimize garage rot. Here are some basic ones. You can fill up your gas tank so that there's as little empty space as possible. This will keep everything inside the tank moist with petrol while also minimizing the potential for water to build up. Now, fuel can go bad if left sitting for too long, so it's a good idea to use a fuel stabilizer if you're planning on storing the car for a couple months or longer. You should also wash the car before you tuck it into bed. This will help ensure that there isn't anything on it that could eat away at the paint while it sleeps. Tires can get flat spots while sitting in place for too long. Tire cushions help prevent this, but you can also lift the car up slightly to take the weight of the vehicle off the tires, or you can even put the car on jack stands and take the wheels off so the weight of the wheels and tires aren't pulling down on the suspension. Now, since Aston Martins are so sensitive to weak batteries, it'd be a good idea to hook up a trickle charger. So hook one of those up and make sure it's actually working properly before you leave it to tend your car. Another thing is rodents. Rodents and other pests have a strange affinity for eating wiring. It's a strange thing, but they do it. So if you live in an area that has these, you'll want to take precautions to help keep them away. Now, there are storage containers like carcoons and other things that are basically plastic bubbles to seal up your car, so you can look into those if you're interested. And then lastly, make sure the handbrake is not engaged while the car is in storage. This will prevent any imprint or rust or other corrosion that occurs where the pads and the rotors are coming in contact. Now, the part of garage rot that is directly tied to maintenance is the engine oil. It's generally a good idea to change your oil right before the car goes into storage. This will make sure that the engine and oil system are filled with clean oil without any contaminants while all that oil sits there unmoving for so long. The very last thing that I want to mention about maintenance is ethanol treatments. The quick down and dirty is that ethanol can eat away at rubber that is not specifically designed to handle it. Damage from ethanol can be very quick, like in the small engines of a lawnmower or something, or it can take a very long time, as is generally the case for a daily driven car. To help minimize any ethanol-related issues, you can use ethanol treatments in your gas. And no, this isn't some snake oil product. I have seen at least a few Aston Martin dealerships myself that have used them. Okay, so there we go. Everything you need to know to maintain a 2005 to 2018 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. I think that covers all the main things, but if I think of anything else, I'll pop them down into the comments section below. The sales on Red Pants are what makes it possible for me to make these videos, so please hop over to Red Pants to buy the things that you need to maintain your car. I still have a couple more videos to make in this series about the V8 Vantage, including that transmission video I mentioned earlier while talking about clutches. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you know when those videos come out. I'll see you next time.